In previous videos, we've talked about the importance of a community of interpretation who uses a primary shared text, reading it with the grain of that text. Using this woodworking metaphor helps us see that when we get to know the wood well, when we work on it regularly and use a certain species, we have a strategy for working with knots and splits and insect holes and other challenges that come our way in making a piece of fine furniture. The beginner might label a piece of wood as scrap or firewood, but the master might make the defects into a showpiece of a work of art. The Bible is a book that's always being interpreted, just like every book. Interpretation is not what happens when we reach a challenging text or something we don't quite understand. Interpretation shapes how humans interact with the world. We are metaphorical creatures, and language is made up pretty much entirely of metaphors. And while we might say tree has factual content, if we define it in a very specific way, it's still not quite accurate. Tree is an idealized category. We're always going to find something that is questionable, right? What's the line between a bush and a tree? It can't just be the size, because bonsai trees exist and miniature trees can be cultivated. And what about a Christmas tree? We imagine a particular triangle-shaped object like the plastic ones that are sold in supermarkets every November. These embody our shared understanding of what a Christmas tree ought to be, but there's no such thing as Christmas trees until they're made by human intent. See, the point is, human intent, a shared understanding of applying Christmas to tree, helps us understand and create a new thing within our community of interpretation. That's what shapes the way we perceive even what is basic and factual. So when we discuss more abstract concepts than trees, of course things are going to get messier. What is justice? What is freedom? What is art? These are the kinds of questions that philosophers love to ask, and everyone has different opinions about that. So interpretation is not what we do when we get to a knot in the text. Interpretation is woodworking as a whole, to continue that metaphor. It's all interpretation all the way down, and if we're hoping that science might be off limits to this, we just need to follow the money. Maybe science doesn't follow interpretation in the same way. Maybe science doesn't need interpretation. But if we look at research and the funding of research and the IPOs of startup tech companies, they're all about telling a story about what this or that tech could do for humanity, how much profit it could make for the investors, and why there's demand for it, etc. Technology is a great story, a great myth that we tell. It doesn't make it unreal. It just means that it doesn't carry the meaning in itself. A car doesn't mean anything. It only means something to what the community sees it as and will use it as and believe it to mean. In a sense, you could say a car without a gas station or an electrical charging apparatus doesn't exist as a car. It's no longer a useful object for what it's intended for. The community needs the framework, the structure, the infrastructure, the metaphors around it to make an object meaningful. So the hope of those who want the Bible to just be have a literal or literalistic reading of the Bible, a face value reading, a bit like having this scientific perspective that we could just carefully define and have an objective perspective on what a car is and what it's for. We have to understand that interpretation is always happening at various levels, from the translation to the cultural assumptions of one's own tradition. Take the rapture, for example. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 16 to 17 is, of course, the source of this idea. The belief is that the text is talking about Jesus coming down to take people out of the earth and into heaven. And if you've been raised to expect this reading, it reads naturally. But again, then you learn that historically this text hasn't been read in this way, that it's largely the development of 18th century theology, and then that changes your face value or literal reading. To take it at face value, or to read it literally, is to take it according to the received tradition of which you are a part. By contrast, if we understand that throughout the rest of the New Testament, the goal of Christ's coming is not to destroy the planet, which God had called good, or very good, but to reconcile all things. And so the coming down of Jesus is that final reconciliation that creation is groaning for, as Paul says in Romans. It's a reconciliation of heaven and earth. It's a marriage feast of God and his people, but also of heaven and earth, as the picture of the book of Revelation. The dwelling place is of God with man, not of man with God. The heavenly city comes down, we don't go up. And so the point isn't that Jesus secretly takes people away and the rest are left for tribulation. The point is that in 1 Thessalonians, that people go to meet Jesus who went up into the heavens as he comes down to welcome him with a triumphal entry. It's a welcome party, not a prison escape. But if you've been trained on viewing the world through the body as a temporary and bad thing, and the world as a temporary and bad thing that we're just passing through and we might as well use it or lose it, because we're losing it anyway, we might as well exploit it, then the rapture makes total sense. If you've been trained to see creation as very good and the incarnation of Jesus as the good news that God became and remains a human being, then it wouldn't be reading 1 Thessalonians 4:16-17 at face value to see it as an escape. So the point is, there are a wide array of ideas that form our interpretation long before we are encountering a text. We're trying to take it literally or at face value, right? Long before we do that, there's a whole backstory that's already happened. Face value is the manifestation of a tradition. So how do we interpret well? The point is to be a good steward of an interpretive community. And this requires understanding of a lot of things, of the author and the history of interpretation, to the best of our abilities. And the first thing to talk about that is genre. What are the rules of the game we're playing with in this kind of communicative form? We have modern genres, right? We have horror movies and action movies, adventure movies, history books, biographies, science fiction, romantic comedy, a scientific journal article, legal codes and legal opinions of the Supreme Court, an investment prospectus, leadership and corporate annual presentations, and so much more. The kind of communication that happens in these spaces is determined by the group writing and reading these things. A research scientist can certainly enjoy Star Trek, the history of Rome, a romantic comedy, and still look at an investment prospectus and make a decision about her financial future. But if we're going to ask her to be an author of something, we might say a research scientist is best suited to writing journal articles about developing and testing hypotheses. But she's going to understand all these different genres. She understands that these are different games people play with the same kinds of language. You're allowed to play within the bounds of certain lines of these games and not to cross them without being disqualified. And so genre is just another way of talking about these rules of the game. And the ancient world, they didn't have most of our same genres. That includes the kind of modern history that we expect. Of course, ancient people related events that happened, but the rules aren't the same between then and now. It's a bit like how soccer developed in England as like village against village, and people died and in these brawls, and it was just like a big massive community brawl. The game we have now with 11 players on the side and distinct rules, it's evolved over time. Ancient people also had genres we don't. They played games that we no longer play, like Jewish apocalyptic literature that we see in books like Daniel, Ezekiel, and Revelation. There are conventions, right, or things that people often do, regular moves or plays people might expect in those literature. For example, there are prophetic pronouncements about the sun and moon going dark, as in Ezekiel chapter 32. And in that chapter, the sun and the moon going dark is applied to a specific place, to Pharaoh and Egypt. The destruction sounds global, but it's clearly applied to a restricted location. That's just part of the rules of the game. They can use global destructive phenomena and apply it locally. To us, reading at face value, you say, you would think, well, it's talking about the moon and the sun going dark, and that's obviously a universal phenomenon for planet Earth, so it must be about a global destruction, except that it's specifically not. That helps us understand some of the rules of the game they were playing. Thus, when we get to New Testament texts that use some of that language, understanding some of the Old Testament, learning the game they were playing in terms of genre helps us understand some of the language about the radical destruction of all things, whether that be in 2 Peter or in the book of Revelation. Another genre we find in the Bible that doesn't quite line up with modern similar versions is what we call law. The law of the Old Testament is not the legal code that we might think of today. It's not something modern lawyers would recognize as the kind of thing that they do. Instead, the word Torah is probably better translated as instruction rather than law. It's the language of covenant, but more in the sense of a formation of a people rather than in terms of a simple contract. So the Psalms, Psalm 1 talks about needing to meditate on Torah day and night in order to become wise, not to become a legally abiding person in every situation. Right? The covenant that God made with Abraham was not a long list of exact scenarios, but a promise to form a man of faith into a faithful tribe that would bless all the world. This is far from modern use of the language of law. We try to create a highly controlled environment through law. We try to restrict people's behavior. We're not necessarily trying to form them. From Roman law all the way to Magna Carta, there's been a long legal tradition that developed fairly independently from the Bible, but then that tradition reinterpreted the Bible as though it was the same kind of law that we have now. The law of the Bible is about a covenant, like a marriage, which is why the prophets frequently use marriage as a metaphor for this covenant, for this law between God and his people. So the law is like a marriage vow. If we have to be reminded, or if we have to remind someone of their marriage vows, it probably means someone has already gone down a path they shouldn't have. The lines have already been crossed. Marriage vows are not fences or stone walls, at least not in a healthy marriage. They're lines in the sand. And similarly, law is, as Paul calls it, a pedagogue, a rule that shows a person the path toward wisdom and maturity. The law is a light unto our feet and a lamp for our path. It's a guide in the way to go. The goal of law is that it would then be internalized, and we could grow beyond needing to talk about it very much. So Jeremiah prophesies this about the new covenant. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and no longer shall each one teach his neighbor, for they shall all know me. From Jeremiah 31, 33 to 34. So biblical law is not the legal code we typically think of in modern society. And that matters, right? The Old Testament sees God as an offended husband or father seeking reconciliation. And so it doesn't have a version of the gospel in which God is about satisfying his own law and finding some kind of legal mechanism to make sure law is satisfied in the end. What needs satisfaction is the kind of relationship God has with his people. And so the stories we get of gospel in the Old Testament, like Hosea, are all about grace for the wayward bride, right? Grace for someone who has gone into adultery and prostitution, not about how the law can be saved in the end. Law in the Bible is about cultivation of a community. Law in the modern world is for making systems of control. And in the modern world, we outsource education to other institutions like schools, and we don't use law for that purpose in the same way. There are other genres that we could discuss at other times, like poetry, prophecy, epistles, wisdom literature. All of these have similarities in other ancient cultures. And the Bible didn't invent its own forms of literature most of the time. It utilized what already existed, though it did, of course, modify it for its own purposes. So to extend the carpentry metaphor, genres are maybe like the different trades. You could build a house out of wood, stone, metal, brick, or animal hides, but the skills involved, the trades involved in building a house out of those materials is quite different and would need to be understood well and practiced well to achieve a quality build out of each of those materials. You'd need different tools. You're doing a very different thing in order to arrive at a similar conclusion. So after we've considered genre, we should talk also about context. The joke in the industry goes that there are three important words in reading and understanding the Bible: context, context, and context. The Gospels, for example, are intentionally written. They don't just document a chronological series of events. They choose which events to tell, when, and how. There's authorial intent in how the events are grouped and why they're told in the order they are. They don't follow the same order between all four Gospels. That's because the authors are trying to show, they're trying to organize the events by other ideas. We see the same in the book of Genesis. It uses a genealogy in its own, it says that this is a genealogy in a number of places. And so we need to understand that single verses don't exist in the Bible. There's no such thing as a single verse. They all occur within whole pieces of writing, and what we're doing is quoting them, just like we would quote from any other book. And you can take quotes out of context. We need to understand single verses then in a context of the story, or pericope, as people call it in the industry, or a chapter, or a whole book. We need to understand all of these different contexts in order to have a good understanding of what's going on. We also have to understand the context of the Bible, right? The genres, its cultural world. And then we also need to understand our own context, understand ourselves. What are we bringing to the Bible from our own world? What are the traditions that have led us to where we are today? As another example, think about John 3:16. This famous passage, taken on its own, invites us to put our own definition into key words, like, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. These are all concepts that don't just occur in John 3:16. How do we know how to define these words? You don't just go straight to a dictionary, especially not an English language dictionary. You're skipping like 8 different interpretive events if you just go to an English dictionary. No, these are all concepts that we have to understand by how the author is using them. So we look at the rest of the story of John chapter 3, of Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus. We look at what these words mean in the rest of John's gospel and the other books that he wrote, like 1 John. We look at these concepts in the cultural context. What do these things mean in their day and their age? We have a very different definition of love today than people in the Bible did. For example, John loves to talk about the world in ways that even other New Testament books don't. And so if we just define world according to what a Bible dictionary says, we're missing out a key concept that John has a specific use for. And the word world is often a very negative thing for John. So how do we understand John 3:16 in light of 1 John 2:15, where he says, "Do not love the world or the things of the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him." But I thought God so loved the world. But we're not meant to love the world. How do you reconcile these texts? How do you, they seem to say the exact opposite thing. And so for us to understand what John 3:16 means, we should probably understand John's theology. So if we just take John 3:16 as a statement that all we have to do is have a specific faith statement and then we get to go to heaven when we die, then we might fail to read John 3:21, a few verses later, where it says, "Whoever does what is true, works, comes to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God." It's not just about having a faith statement. John, or Jesus, in his conversation with Nicodemus, goes on right away to talk about works. Doing what is true, doing good works are a manifestation of walking in the light. So you can't just believe it with your head. You can't just confess it with your lips. You got to do stuff, according to John 3. The whole notion of being born again, then, that comes from John chapter 3, has a cultural context for the ancient world. That's very different than the one that emerged out of 20th century evangelicalism. Jesus is arguing that the true identity of Jewishness belongs not to flesh and blood, but to those who have the Spirit and act like Abraham. How do I know this? Well, that's exactly what Jesus says in John's Gospel. He says, "If you were Abraham's children, you would be doing the works that Abraham did," from John 8:39. So being born again, being born of the Spirit, or born from above, again or from above is, in Greek, we don't, it could mean one or the other. So being born again or born from above, that's not so much about having an inner life experience. That might be a manifestation of it. It's about moving from darkness to light. It's about walking in a different way, about being born into a different household, being part of God's family, having a new father, living out of a new family identity. All this is fairly clear when we study John's Gospel. If we read John 3:16 and just bring in all of our old songs and sermons and things we've heard, we're not understanding it in its context. We're understanding it in a specific modern religious context. And there might be overlap there. It could be a fine interpretation of John 3:16, but we need to get there by understanding what John is talking about. He wrote a whole book. He didn't write one chapter or one verse. So in some ways, the invention of chapter and verse caused unforeseen, probably negative consequences. Prior to chapter and verse, which were a product of the Middle Ages, the context was a little more obvious. After chapter and verse were invented, the Bible could be broken up into minuscule fragments, so we imagined that meanings of things could stand up in isolation. In a sense, it shifted the genre of the Bible from stories that should be read as whole pieces to a reference book. To recap, we've seen that all reading is always already interpretation. So we need to do this well as an art that we cultivate as a community. We pay attention to genre and to context in order to better understand the meaning of texts, and now we must build a bridge from ourselves in the present to the past, stopping not just at the point at which the Bible was written, but stopping all along the way to pick up all the pieces, to pick up all the building blocks. We've had 2,000 years of interpretative tradition, right? The Bible's not just modern people reading an ancient book. There's a lot of accretion of assumptions over the years. We saw that with the rapture, but other traditions significantly inform normal Bible reading. We could talk about later economics and the development of money, later theories of justice, as we talked about with law, traditions about hell derived from pagan influence, the elevation of Satan to a near-peer rival to God, in which there's a sort of dark versus light duality to it that comes from Manichaeism and or Zoroastrianism, these dualistic religions with a light and a dark God. Other ones, like I wrote in Unfortunate Words of the Bible, how the mistranslation of a single word in a Greek translation of the Old Testament created an entire tradition of belief in the existence of unicorns that were never there in the Bible in the original texts. So if we don't know anything about tradition beyond the last few generations or the last 100 years, those who preach and teach from the Bible are more than likely just going to repeat cultural expectations about what they think it should be talking about. So it's our job to build these reconciling bridges to the past through communities and tradition. This means relying on one another to understand the Bible together. We have to be aware of the traditions we've inherited and be willing to be critical stewards of it. It's not all bad. Not all of our traditions are bad and need to be gotten rid of. And we don't avoid error simply by reacting against our forebears and saying, well, they got it wrong and we must have it right. And we don't define our community by what we're not, or by what we're protesting, or by who we're departing from. We ought to define our community by the bridges of reconciliation we're building to the past and to the people around us. And this is the work we have to do. Dead people can't do it for us, but they've left a lot of building materials for us. And there's been a line of stewards in the form of monks and pastors and scholars, professors, educated lay people. There have been people working to do this over all the generations. And so hermeneutics, as we call it, the art of interpretation, is not about fixing misunderstandings, but about realizing that understanding is always interpretation, and interpretation is always a community project, and we ought to take responsibility for that process and not pursue it in ignorance. Ignorance is bliss, yes, but it's also a clear path to error. Tradition and community should be a home, a welcome, warm, joyful place from which we then go out and explore. We learn new things, we engage with the world, and to which home we return for comfort, for refreshment, for community, for rediscovering and getting back to our roots and sharing our learning. Tradition shouldn't be a prison, something stuck in time, fixated around a particular theologian, a particular doctrine statement as the once and final truth delivered once for all to all people in all times and places. Communities of interpretation are meaning makers and stewards of meaning. They're givers of purpose, able to take the data of life and engage with it faithfully with Scripture and in wisdom to produce the fruit of maturity and responsibility. When we combine all these elements, genre, context, original location, modern ideas, and intervening traditions, when we do that, we build a house within which the people of God can live and thrive and encounter the world that we live in today with creativity and with the truth of the Word of God. We're all carpenters, learning to work with the grain and build a strong structure out of the information God has given us about Himself in the Bible.